So the last few sessions of the Jewish journey, we looked at Kabbalah, we looked at Jewish mysticism over 3 sessions. And as I mentioned when we started this new Wednesday format, um, we're really kind of I'm trying to keep to 90 minutes, but it's actually a lot harder because normally we would have texts, we would read through the texts, and if we got through them, whatever we got through, we kind of stopped at in some cases, and that was it. But this is more of a class and more like teaching a college class, and and so some of them require multiple sessions, and they also kind of like trying to figure out, making sure, hey, this comes out to roughly what we're going to be doing because I haven't. It's been a long time since I taught this type of class. The next few weeks are going to be about Jewish history. Now, what's interesting is we learn Jewish history all the time, uh, in the sense that when we were learning Kabbalah, we talked about the development of Kabbalah over historic time period. But what we're doing now, and you can make the argument maybe we should have started with this, is to talk about um, the timeline, really, to look at it as a timeline. And so there's going to be 6 sessions. This first session is really covering stuff that's in the Bible. So for people who've been reading, especially the Tuesday morning class folks, the people who've been reading the Bible with us, what we call Beyond the Torah study for the last 5 years, that really covered the period that we're going to be talking about today, a good chunk of the period we're going to be talking about today, which is really the biblical period. Um, and then next week, we're going to be talking about stuff that's also in the Bible, and looking at, and I'll just kind of today, I'll just kind of take you through a little bit of what we're going to be doing over over these next weeks. The class after that, so tonight is going to be the really Genesis, what we know. And look, I already put up as kind of as I've shared what we know archaeologically versus what the Bible tells us. Because instead of looking at it from the Bible first, we're going to be looking at it with the Bible, but also, what do we really know from the archaeological evidence. So tonight is kind of the origins, the biblical world. Next week we're going to be talking about exile, the destruction of the temple, and the Babylonian and Persian period, which is covered at the end of the historical period of the Bible and the books of Kings and Chronicles, things that we just read actually in our Tuesday classes. And then the next class we're going to be looking at the rabbinic period, what happened during the Second Temple period, which is after the Bible is finished. So this is not in the Bible, but it is in the Talmud, it is in the Midrash, which we've also talked about early on in these Wednesday classes. And of course, we talked about it in Midrash class, and we talked about it, the rabbis in the rabbinic period. But we're going to really look at like where that fit in within the Roman Empire. And then after that, we're going to be going into the medieval Jewish period, looking at Judaism as it comes into contact and in conflict with Christianity and Islam. It's an era. Some people call it the Dark Ages. Some people call it the Middle Ages. Some people call it the medieval period. Uh, I liked what Will and Ariel Durant, when they did their Great History series books, those many volumes that used to be on everyone's library, the Durant history series. They called this period the Age of Faith, which is nicer than saying the medieval period or the Dark Ages. Next comes the period of modernity, from the Renaissance, what we call the Emancipation period, on to kind of right through till the Holocaust, till 75, 80 years ago. And then the last section, um, really the present era, the modern era of Judaism. We're going to focus on Israel, Zionism, and then American Judaism. And what does it mean again? Where do we fit in as Jews of this period to those who came before us, and then maybe also speculate on what the future looks like. what will the next period look like? What will this period be called? I mean, my guess is it's going to be called the period of modern Israel, but we'll talk about that in the last. So that's six classes of about 90 minutes. And so we're going to jump into this one to now tonight, which is again the one that we're familiar with, especially the people who've been reading the Bible with me over the last several years. Some of you have been reading the Bible with me for 25 years now. And so we oftentimes look at the Bible, we look at the text through many different lenses. Today, I want to talk about what do we learn from it? What do we know historically from it? Also, to some extent, what are the limits of it? Because, of course, the Bible is not a history. It contains history. There's elements of history there, but it's not a book written for history. It's definitely a book of meaning. It's a book of figuring out where we stand as humans, and specifically where we stand as Jews in the scope of history, and also, of course, in to be in the presence of God. But there is, to some extent, the responsibility for us to kind of say, but are there elements of history here? And so we're going to talk about that, and we're going to open that up and look at some texts that will be familiar to you. Some of you who have started this week, we started the Genesis on Tuesday mornings, and we've already posted up on our YouTube channel. We posted up the discussion yesterday from Genesis chapter 1. We're going to be looking at some texts from Genesis tonight, and texts that we'll get into in a few weeks on Tuesday morning. We'll look at them in depth when we get to those stories. But the Tuesday morning Genesis class is looking at there's about 50 or so stories in Genesis, and they're really organized as stories. But we do have to some extent mine them for history. And if you look at this chart, we're going to talk first about this period right here, the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah, which the Bible, as you know, describes them as nomads. It makes it very clear that they are people who, according to Genesis, and actually, let's do that right now. Let's post up a text from the Bible. By the way, before I just jump into the Bible, any questions or comments or anything so far that anybody wants to say about history before we jump into it, the Jewish history, if you will? Well, let's jump in then, because again, I just showed this yesterday. This is the 50 chapters of Genesis. These don't line up into the 50 stories. Some of them are, but some of them spill over a little bit. And as we saw yesterday, Genesis chapter 1, which is the story of creation that we would call the priestly version, or kind of the more mechanical version of creation, in the sense that God creates things and builds things and creates space for things. That actually spills over to Genesis chapter 2. The first three verses are still part of that version. And generally speaking, again, these stories, some of them will be a chapter. But we're going to skip to the chapter where we actually read about the first Jew. So this is Genesis chapter 12, which means the first 11 chapters of Genesis is not there. These are texts that are not about Jews. They are, if you will, about all of humanity. They're about all of humanity's ancestors, right? Because it goes all the way to Noah, and Noah is his family, his descendants are described in chapter 11. And then in chapter 12, chapter 11 is also the list of the nations that come out of Noah, the 70 nations. And we'll look at that as you can imagine, in about 7, 8 weeks, 9 weeks from now on our Tuesday morning class. We'll look at that in depth. But I guess the week later we'll be in chapter 12, which is Lech Lecha. It's not only the beginning of a new chapter, it's the beginning of a new Torah portion, which again, the Torah portions definitely don't line up necessarily with chapters. They're not intended to. The Torah portions, as we read them as Jews, existed well before the chapters. And most Torah portions, if you recall, are about 3 or 4 chapters in length. And they contain, in most cases, they contain several stories. So, for example, Genesis begins the Torah portion, Bereshit, is the first 5 chapters of Genesis, which means you've got both creation stories, the Cain and Abel story, and the introduction to Noah, and then you get into the Noah story in the next parsha, which goes from chapter 6 all the way to chapter 11. So the third portion, which is pretty soon, you're now in to Lech Lecha, the story of Avram, the first Hebrew. But that also means that there are 20 generations of people, of humanity, and they live a really long time, if you recall. Thousands of years elapse between Adam and Eve and Abraham and Sarah, Avram and Sarah, or as we're going to see, eventually his name becomes Avraham. But at first, God calls him and says, "Go forth, Lech Lecha, from your native land, from your father's house, to the land I will show you. I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you, and I will make your name great. And you shall be a blessing, and I will bless those who bless you, and curse those who curse you. And all the families of the earth shall bless themselves by you." And then it says, of course, that Avram went forward and he did what God said. But this call in Genesis chapter 12 is what sets into motion, of course, this call, this promise puts into motion to some extent Jewish history. The Jewish people come into existence here. And you can see a national identity is promised from the very beginning, that Avram is going to be a great people. Now, of course, literally 1,000 years has to elapse before we get to that nation where they're actually a goy gadol. That's the word that is used. Again, the word goy we usually see as Gentile nation, but the word in Hebrew literally means a goy, a people. And here it says you're going to be a goy gadol, a big nation, a major nation, a great nation. And this is interesting because, of course, we have Avram being called, being promised, and also being blessed. All of it, to some extent, is wrapped around a promise that, if you will, takes generations to unfold. And this is it's difficult to say how important this is because when it was written, when it was edited, when it was first thought of, even if it existed first as an oral tradition, do you understand that what happens here is there is the possibility that a people can exist around an idea, around a promise. They don't have the nation. They don't have it yet. They don't have the land. He gets to go to the land. He gets to see the land. He gets to travel around the land, but he doesn't. He never owns the land. Avram, in his whole existence, never builds a city. He doesn't build anything. He doesn't do anything other than bless places, create, a holy place by the fact he was there. But he doesn't build one city. He doesn't live in a city. Every myth that we read about in every culture, their hero, their ancestor, their progenitor builds the city, creates a territory with his own hands and makes it happen. Now, he may lose it. He may have a child that comes and takes it from him, whatever the myth you can think of, whatever version of that. But they do it. They do it themselves. They see it realized in their lifetime. What's interesting is not only because this doesn't happen, and one could argue it's done because the people know that it took hundreds of years for this to happen. Remember, how could they have known unless, again, they knew things that we didn't? And again, that this promise and this blessing and everything being wrapped around the hope will allow us to survive for 2,000 years without a home. Because if we can survive for 1,000 years before we have the home, it places within us the ability to have an existence even without our home, even without the full promise, the realization of this. So this is, I mean, this is huge, not just because it's what we believe. It's not just because it's the promise of the land, but the fact that the promise can exist without the land. The promise can exist as an idea, as a hope. Yeah, that's pretty significant. If we go up a little further, and again, just a couple chapters later, we have um, we have a scene here where God comes to Avram in a vision, and he says to him, "I'm a shield to you, and your reward shall be very great." He still doesn't have any kids at this point, and he makes him go through this covenant ceremony. And Avram's doesn't even have kids yet, and he should have had kids by this point. So he's kind of wondering, like, how am I going to make this happen? We don't have the land. I don't have kids. And God reminds him, he says, I brought you here. I brought you out of the land of Ur to assign you this land as a possession. And Avram challenges him, how do I know? And so Avram brings forward a sacrifice, a cow, a heifer, and a goat, and a ram, and a turtle dove, and another bird, and he cuts them in half. This is called the covenant of the halves. He cuts these animals, and as this vision and this conversation unfolds, Avram is told, your family, you're going to have a family, and they're going to be essentially slaves. And Avram's told by God that in order for the people to be able to take over the land, the people who are living there, the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. So he basically tells them, eventually the Canaanites, the Amorites, the people who are living there already, they have to completely fall to the worst situation, and then I can get them out of there. Then I have justification to get them out of there. So it's a very interesting idea, which is that, okay, we're going to have to go through some tough times in order to achieve this. And that's to get it in the first place. This is before the exile. This is before everything else. This is going to lead us to the next very important part of our story, which is the story of Moses. But look again at what the Bible is telling us here, which is that it's going to take time for this to happen, or it's going to take time for you to realize your greatness. Again, this idea of hope. And of course, also a warning, if you will. And framed within that, by the way, too, is this understanding that, wow, the Amorites are being kicked out because they haven't done the right things. Maybe that same situation would happen to us, which of course we're going to see most definitely is, which is you don't want to wind up like those people that got kicked out. By the way, I want to point out one other thing too that we sometimes forget when we talk about Avram and this journey, and that is that Avram starts out at Ur of the Chaldeans. He's from Ur. Ur literally means the city. He's from Babylonia. He's from the Chaldean heartland. He's from Mesopotamia, and he's moved to the land of Israel. This, in those days, was moving to the country. I compare it to Green Acres. This is somebody from the city moving to the country and finding that they don't really know how to fit in with these kinds of people. It says he was already a city dweller going to the land of Israel to be a nomad. That's not a normal journey. It's not what people normally did. So keep that in mind too. There, there's there is a journey here, and it's not the journey you think or you might have thought. Any questions? Any comments? The Bible, especially in Genesis, and this is why I love it, and the fact that we're studying it again on Tuesdays is a great joy. What happens over the rest of Genesis? We read about Isaac, we read about Jacob and his wives, Rachel and Leah. We read about Joseph. And for the next literally 35 chapters of the Bible, because this is chapter 15, goes to chapter 50. For the next 35 chapters, we read about sibling rivalry. We read about relationships and families, which is what we're going to be talking about, of course, and discussing as we go through these stories of Genesis. But we really see the challenges of what human beings go through on a very real level. It's not necessarily about national identity at all. It's really about the relationships that people have with their family, with their community. And so it's very real. It's very relevant because it's always relevant as long as we're in relationship with people. There's powerful stories here, deeply powerful stories. And so that's what we read about in Genesis. That's what we'll be reading about in Genesis, and I'm looking forward to it. And I will also tell you that one of the themes that's in Genesis, and then kind of goes through the rest of the narrative of the Bible, is that history, relationships, life never goes the way you think it's going to go. The child that you don't assume is going to be the one who's the leader is the leader. The person who was supposed to do something doesn't do it, and the other person does it and then becomes, successful doing it. The seventh child becomes the one who leads the family, not the first, not the second, the seventh child. So these and in Joseph's situation, the 11th child or the 11th son comes forward and is the hero. So it's never who you think it's going to be. And so it's about relationships. It's not really about law. It's not about the territory. It's not about conquest. It's not about just exile, destruction. It's about families. And that's Genesis. Now, real quick, back to the chart. What does the archaeology tell us? We never found evidence for Abraham, Isaac, or Jacob. We've not found any archaeological evidence from those people. However, the things that are described in the book of Genesis, for the most part, lines up very nicely with what we found in the archaeology. So while we don't have direct evidence of the individuals, what's described there is consistent with what the Bible is saying is happening, which is why we can come to the conclusion that they reflect plausible ancient settings, right? There's not people that we can verify. We can't hold up Abraham's cup, if you will, or hold up Jacob's tent. But the stories are plausible in the way they're described with the settings, the way that they the way the stories tell us about these people. Okay? It's not always the case in the biblical stories, which we're going to take a look at. Because as we know, Joseph winds up in Egypt as a slave, and he eventually invites his family to come down to live with them. And that's how the book of Genesis ends, with all of the all 70 people at that time, again, the whole family, which was the brothers and all their children and now grandchildren, they wind up in Egypt. Now, we don't have evidence that the Israelites were enslaved in Egypt. We haven't found evidence of it. And the reason we are looking for that kind of evidence is because the Egyptians kept pretty good records. And we have records for things that are older than that in Egypt. We have records, hieroglyphics, and we have accounts of things that happened before that. So it's possible that we would have. We haven't found it. Doesn't mean we won't, it just means we haven't found it yet. We also, as you see to the next thing, which we're going to talk about, we don't have evidence of a large scale exodus. Because as we get into the book of Genesis, out of Genesis and move into Exodus, there we get to the Exodus, led by Moses, of course. We haven't found any direct evidence of Moses, and we haven't found any direct evidence of the Exodus, of a mass Exodus, which has led people to believe that maybe it didn't happen. The problem is to get from there's no evidence of 3 million people leaving, because again, it's 600,000 adult men, and saying that there is no evidence that it couldn't be based on some things that were happening there, because we do know by the Egyptian records that there were Semitic people that were living in the land of Egypt during around this period, and in some cases they had risen to the top of the society in Egypt, and in some cases, and for some years, actually took over. Okay, so we know that that happened, and the fact that the Bible in Genesis and Exodus talks about the Egyptians being fed up with these Semites controlling them, it's a little similar, but we don't have evidence of a mass exodus. It doesn't mean that there weren't people that were kicked out who went back to maybe the land of Canaan. It just maybe wasn't that many people. And that's a possibility. And it could be, again, that maybe it was one of the tribes or one group of Israelites that came back and then reintegrated themselves back into the land of Israel. There's a theory that kind of balances these things, the archaeological evidence in the Bible. And again, we have to be careful. We don't want to fit what we have archaeologically into the Bible. I mean, we're not obligated to do that. But there is a possibility that perhaps, and it was one of the biblical historians of the last 50 years, one of the great biblical historians is a guy named Baruch Halpern. Baruch Halpern speculated that what the Torah is really telling us is about the Levites who were in Egypt, Canaanite, Israelite people, Semites, that were in the land of Egypt, who came out led by a Moses or somebody from the Levite tribe, Moses and Aaron, and they came back and had to be reintegrated into the land of Israel. Now, the problem was they had no territory in the land of Israel. And so the compromise was the Levites got to live amongst all the people and were given sacrifices, were given animals to be sustained as a, if you will, a concession. It's a possibility. It's a theory. We don't have exact evidence for it, but maybe that's a way to explain what happens. Why is it so much the Levites who are leading the people when they're coming out? Maybe it was really the Levites. And again, this compromise allowed for them to live there. Something to think about. But we do know that this is an important part of our story, because not only do we make this journey, right? Not only do we make this journey into the promised land, but we also do something very important too, which is, of course, what's really important about what happens to us in the desert? Somebody? Anybody? What happens to us in the desert? Is anybody there?
We survived.
We did survive, but something happened to us in the wilderness. Something happened to us. And I just put it on the screen. It's Genesis chapter 20.
The Ten Commandments.
Yeah, we get the law. We get the law. And so by getting the law, we now have the ability, at least the way the Bible tells us, to know what to do when we get to the promised land. Now, if you want to say this is a foundational national myth, which is what some people say, again, there's this is where you start getting people getting very agitated. When you tell them there was no Exodus, there was no Mount Sinai, there was when you start telling people that kind of stuff, they flip out. And I think, people do it to get a rise out of people. And maybe you look, maybe they do it because they can say, hey, we don't have any evidence for it. But just because you don't have evidence, you haven't found archaeological evidence, doesn't mean that you won't eventually. And it also may mean that, again, maybe the story was embellished. Maybe there's a level to this which is, um, enhanced, if you will. But it doesn't mean that some aspect of this didn't happen. Obviously, what happens at Mount Sinai is very important for us because, again, it's not just a matter of getting the law, but it's this covenant that happens at Mount Sinai that we actually look at as a national covenant. So we have a personal covenant when we have a boy. We are traditionally supposed to have a brit milah, a circumcision, a brit of covenant of circumcision. Uh, but the covenant, to some extent, is for that individual, and his responsibility within the family. And now we have a covenant for a girl. We call it Brit Bat. We say this girl is covenanted, this young woman, and will be a part of our people, and it's important for her to have a covenant. But we have a national covenant in Mount Sinai, an agreement that God is our God and we're going to follow the rules. And this is very important because only then does the Bible tell us, are we ready to come into the land? Only then can we make that next step, which is our coming into the land. And I will show you how important that is. Because even if the book of Deuteronomy was written hundreds of years later, we talked about it just the other day, that it was found during the time of King Josiah. And the speculation is they wrote it during the time of King Josiah. But regardless, what it says in Deuteronomy is a reminder. You were in the wilderness for 40 years. And remember, this is put in Moses's mouth to remind the people as they're about to cross into the land what all that time was. You were, and this is one of my favorite chapters in the whole Torah, not the whole Bible. I say the whole Torah for sure, because it summarizes what the experience of the wilderness was about to test you. It was to test you to see if you were ready, put you through hell. It was boot camp. This was whether you could make it, you know? But I took care of you, right? I did take care of you there. But it was also a discipline, like a parent does to a child. And there it says, keep the mitzvot, keep the commandments of God. And it says, for the eternal is bringing you into a good land. It's a good land, right? A land of wheat, barley, vines, figs, pomegranates, and olives, plus honey. What that kind of honey is, whether it's the honey from dates or whether it's the honey from bees, there's arguments over that. But these are the 7 species. These are the 7 things that are special about the land of Israel. That if you can have these 7 things, wow, that's a wonderful thing. And we think about that because in just a couple of days, folks, it's the holiday of Tu B'Shvat, which is the 15th of Shvat, time we talk about trees in the land of Israel. And some people have a tradition to eat these things on Tu B'Shvat, to put together a little meal of wheat and barley and vines and figs, little grapes, little figs, pomegranates, olives, dates, to have some of these foods, because this is what makes this land special, is you get these foods there, right? And you're going to be able to mine the land. And then it says, "V'achalta v'savata u'varachta et Adonai Elohecha." And then you've eaten your fill, right? When you've eaten, you're feeling good. Give thanks to your God for the good land that God gave you. It's a beautiful line, and it's something that we say as part of the Birkat Hamazon, the blessing after a meal. V'achalta v'savata u'varachta. You've eaten, You're filled, you bless. 3 steps, right? And then it tells you, take care lest the eternal your God, right? You got to keep these laws, right? Right. And it says, beware lest your heart grow haughty and you forget the eternal your God, who freed you from the land of Egypt, the house of bondage, who led you through the great and terrible wilderness with the seraphs, serpents, and scorpions, a parched land with no water. Exact opposite, right? Who brought forth water from the flinty rock, who fed you with manna, right? And you have these hardships to get there, right? And you say to yourself, by my own power and the might of my own hand, I've won this wealth for me. Uh-uh. Remember, it's God who gives you the power to get those things. So always have humility, right? Always remember. Then, of course, it's and if you do forget the eternal your God and follow other gods to serve them or bow down to them, I warn you this day that you shall certainly perish like the nations that God will cause to perish before you. So shall you perish because you did not heed the eternal your God. And there it is. So again, if it's written by people who knew it was about to happen, they had gotten to the end of the rope, that's it. But look at this. You are going to wind up just like the Canaanites. You have to have that humility. You have to understand that your land is yours because God gave it to you. And you have a responsibility. You have to have a sense of humility, which will lead to that again, that sense of responsibility. There's things you have to do. And so, to some extent, this is the setup. This is told from the perspective of Moses before he's turning it over to the next generation, to Joshua. And of course, what happens next? And again, while we don't have archaeological evidence for up to this point, now we start getting into some areas where there's debate over what we have. Okay? Because we do see changes in the land of Israel during this period. And what I'm going to tell you about this period, and again, some people have said, well, we found evidence that the city of Jericho was destroyed. Well, we do. The problem is it was destroyed several times, and we're not 100% sure that what was found was the destruction that happened during the time of Joshua. So people have been looking for this for a long time. I'm going to tell you that. But what we know is that according to the Bible, the people come in. Moses dies here. The people cross over here. They cross the Jordan River, and they come to Jericho. They come to Ai, to Bethel, to Gilgal, and they go to the well, they go west, but then they go out north and south, and they start conquering the land during the time of Joshua, right? And they have to go all the way up here, which, by the way, is all the way up into the parts of Lebanon. So this conquest, of course, will lead to this, which is where the 12 tribes live. This is what happens for about 200 years. We have military.
Rabbi,
Yeah,
is there a burial place for Moses?
yeah, but it's over here. It's in Jordan, and we don't know where it is because the Bible tells us in Deuteronomy God buried Moses so that we would never know where Moses is buried. So we don't know where it is, but it's not in the land of Israel. The other people we have, like Joshua and some of these other prophets, we have places that are supposedly where they're buried. And of course, we have a place where Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are buried, and all the women except for Rachel is the cave of Machpelah right over here in Hebron. But here we have the areas that the tribes lived in. So these are the 12 tribes. And as you can see, Judah is huge, right? Judah is the largest of the tribes. Manasseh is pretty big too. There's two parts of Manasseh, the part inside the land of Israel and the part that's in modern day Jordan and goes into Syria. Um, This is a very big tribe too, Ephraim. And then you get to Benjamin, which is where Jerusalem is. This is the heartland. Now, of course, as we've talked about before, the problem with this is if we look at a map of modern day Israel, all of these places that are here in the West Bank. The areas that are here, the cities that are here, Jaffa, Ashdod, Ashkelon, Gaza, Gath, these are all Philistine cities or Canaanite cities. The stuff on the coast is not really controlled by us. Now, it should be, they're tribal portions, but in the reality, what we know, and the Bible tells us this, and not just the archaeology, we were not able to get the Philistines out of these areas. And so, all of these places, all these cities that you see, all of these cities are here. They're all within the West Bank. This is Judea. We call the area of Judea. And this is Samaria. This is Shomron. Now, most of these areas in Shomron we're not as concerned about because, quite frankly, they weren't part of Judah. The further south part, which is Jerusalem, and then this area here where Hebron and Bethlehem and these places, and of course, this is where Masada is, but this area right here, which all would have been the West, it's all the West Bank. All of these areas that are mentioned throughout the Bible, they're in the West Bank because the areas of Judah, Benjamin, Ephraim, and Manasseh, for the most part, again, all of these places are not in the West Bank, but they're not major cities. And again, as I said, these ones are not even Israelite cities. These areas are not, I mean, these are not major places in the Bible. These ones all are. So that's why when we talk about whether a lot of these places have been excavated, the answer is no, because they are primarily underneath Palestinian homes and or Palestinian communities. So when people say, well, where's the archaeology? We can say we don't have access to it. So what we do have is archaeological evidence for new villages that appear in this part of Judea and Samaria during this period, around 1200. Now, the divergence from what we have in the Bible might be based on the fact that we don't see a lot of conquest. We don't see areas that were necessarily destroyed and then built on. Instead, we see places where there weren't people before, and then there are from around this period of time. So one of two things diverges somewhat from the Bible, which is either we didn't conquer a lot of places, in which case we built a lot of places, but we didn't conquer a lot of places, or or so that's one, but it's a divergence. The other divergence would be that some people feel is maybe more plausible, which is if there isn't evidence for a mass migration from Egypt, there isn't evidence for us destroying places, then Israel develops through internal development, but not conquest, which is another way of saying what? Anybody? Anybody?
Well, they were Canaanite, indigenous, probably Canaanite DNA.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. The Israelites were Canaanite. And that what really differentiated us was our different beliefs and our desire to some extent to not live like Canaanites. Yeah. So that's what many that theory, if you will, or that I mean, I would say it's a theory, but it's almost taken as the history now, is that the Israelites developed as people who didn't want to live like the Canaanites, which means, again, fits into this idea that we didn't want to do human sacrifice. Even though we were still doing it, we didn't want to do it. And we didn't want to live in cities. We didn't want to live behind walls. And we didn't want to, we didn't want to live like uh live like Canaanite people anymore. Now, during this period of Joshua and then the period of Judges, when the tribes didn't have a king, the Bible tells us that we were being led by judges, and we were supposed to be living according to the Torah. We do find that there is something that we can differentiate with the archaeology between the pottery of Israelites versus Canaanites. And we also do see a difference in construction in Canaanite versus Israelite areas. Remember, this is still a problem because a lot of the areas that we should be able to excavate, we can't. Now, we have found some Israelite villages in the north, in the areas that are under part of Israel, right? There are some of these places like Megiddo and Tanakh, and some Shomron is in Samaria, obviously, but there are places we can excavate. And there's some places in the West Bank where there aren't people living that we've been able to excavate. But yeah, a lot of the stuff under some of these places we can't excavate. So, all I'm saying is don't just say we don't have the evidence. There's a reason we don't have the evidence. We don't have the evidence because we're not allowed to excavate in those areas.
Well, don't cities normally, they tend to build on top of other cities because you have a water source, maybe you have better crops.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And so if there are people living here in Shechem, which is now called Nablus, which is one of the major cities for the Palestinians, right? We can't excavate Shechem. We can't. Because yes, it's one city built on top of other cities. Jericho, which we have done some excavations, the British started excavating it when they controlled it. You can do some excavations there, but it's also underneath a modern city of Jericho, which is home to tens of thousands of people, Palestinians. So we can't go in there and excavate. So yes, there are, and again, as you've probably heard, Jericho is one of the most continuously inhabited cities in the world. Right here. It's not on the map because it's not one of the
We don't tend to think of that. Being Americans, we live on land that hasn't had people on it all that long. You
no.
imagine a land where you walk and you find a coin that's been, like in England or something. It's so ancient. We don't just have those things.
No. No, we
Where
don't.
one civilization has been built up on top of another.
No, we don't. And the reality is, if we do any excavations, it's generally of Native American areas with their permission or with their blessing if they actually want to excavate it. But yeah, it's the only real history that we're excavating. It's real history. But yeah, it's not something we see in America. But like I said, I mean, the main thing is let's be careful to say what's not there because there's a lot of stuff we haven't been able to do, and we're going to get to that right now because we're going to talk about the next phase, which is the monarchy, the period of the monarchy. Now, again, this area of the conquest, the time of the conquest, the time of the tribes is the time of Joshua and Judges. And then we get into the book of Samuel and we get the description of the first monarchs, the first kings. And here we're going to see something, of course, that's kind of interesting as we look at the biblical text again. We go out of the Torah now and into the book of Samuel. And as we go as we go into the book of Samuel, I'm laughing because it's one of my favorite lines of the rest of the Bible. I'm showing you some of these stories with an understanding again that these are obviously the texts that kind of tell us about our history. Um, during the time of the judges, one of the last judges and prophets, and uh, a real important leader because he's also works as a priest, is Shmuel. And Samuel's interesting situation is that his sons, he's trying to make his sons the next judges, which again, it's not really the way things go. You know, you're supposed to kind of be chosen by God as a judge, but he's trying to do a little nepotism here of putting his sons up for promotion. But the people come to him and say, you know, your sons are not really very good. And they say it euphemistically. They have not followed in your ways. And they say to Samuel, give us a king, right? Give us a king. They're not working out. And more importantly, we want to be like all the other nations. And right off the bat, you know, you can see this is not a good situation. They're not coming for the right reasons. And even more so, again, uh, Samuel sees this as his failure, right? And so Samuel goes to God and says, they want a king. And God said to Samuel, heed the demand of the people, everything they say to you. For it is not you they have rejected, it is me they have rejected to rule over them. Like everything else they've done ever since I brought them out of Egypt. They forsake me, they go worship other gods, and they're doing it to you too. Heed their demand, but warn them and tell them about the practices of the kings who will rule over them. And so Samuel went back to the people and he tells them, and here's the warning. Here's the warning. And for those who were with us when we read the book of Samuel back in like 2022, you might have forgotten this, but this is Samuel's warning about what happens with kings. This will be the practice of the king who will rule over you. He will take your sons and appoint them as his charioteers and riders, and they will serve as outrunners for his chariots, which means they're going to be conscripted. He will appoint them as chiefs of thousands and of fifties, or they will have to plow his fields and reap his harvest and make his weapons and the equipment for his chariots. So you're going to take your sons who've been working for you, by the way. That's the way the family structure is. Your kids work for you, and then eventually they get the business, they get the farm. No, they're going to be working for the king now. And then he says the king will take your daughters as perfumers and cooks and bakers, and also take them for his wives too. Right? He will seize your choice fields, your vineyards, and olive groves, and give them to his courtiers. He will take a tenth part of your grain and vintage and give it to his eunuchs and courtiers. He will take your male and female slaves, your choice young men, and your donkeys, and put them to work for him. He will take a tenth part of your flocks, and you shall become his slaves. The day will come when you will cry out because of the king whom you yourselves have chosen, and God will not answer you on that day. So Samuel tells him, of course, exactly what happens. Now, it's not hard for Samuel to make that prediction or God's prediction, because that's what every king had done up until that time anyways. And so there's nothing really weird about what he's saying. He's not saying anything unique for what the Israelite kings are going to be. But yeah, he warns them. He says it's not going to work out good. But of course, the people wanted him. We must have a king over us. Let our king rule over us and go out at our head and fight our battles. So he does, goes and makes a king, right? He goes and gets him. And that first king, I'm not going to take you all the way through it, is this guy right here. His name was Saul. And he's made the first king. And of course, as we know, he doesn't work out. Not a good guy, not a good king. Good warrior. Good warrior. People are very impressed with his battle prowess, but he's not responsible and he doesn't do what God tells him to do. He's told to go out, destroy the Amalekites completely, and he doesn't do it. He spares them, he keeps their property. And if you will, he fails the test. And so Samuel comes to him and says, "You're done. I'm giving God's given someone else a chance now. You failed." And of course, that person will be King David. And that will be, as we pointed out before, the end of the United Monarchy, because then we have a I'm going to show it to you all. And for those who have been with us on Tuesday morning, you know this, you know this piece really, really well. You've seen it a lot. You know I love this. You know I love this one. You know I love this chart. Here comes the chart. Here it is. Whoa. Here's our chart. King chart. There it is. You know this chart. You saw this all throughout Kings, all throughout Chronicles. You know this chart.
Many times.
The King chart. So there you got.
We need to be able to download that, Rabbi.
I'm going to put it up. I'm putting it up. All this stuff will be up tonight. So this is the chart. And this is a good chart because it tells you who's the king during which period. And it also tells us what the Bible says about whether they were good or bad. And more importantly, the fact that almost all of them start off one way and end up the other way. Very few of them are good or evil the whole time. A lot of them, start out good and wind up bad, like this guy right here, King Solomon. David is one of the few who starts off good and ends good. And by the way, along the way, doesn't always do good things. And here's the prophets that are alive during that time. And then, of course, here's the texts that talk about this time. So this has got everything. And of course, then once the kingdom is separated during the time of Solomon, the fracture already starts happening. So David is a united king for his most of his life. Not all of his life, right? Because for part of the time he's only the king of Judah, and then he's king of the United Kingdom, and then there's David's son Solomon. So from about 1000 to about 930, it's about 80 years, and not all the 1000. So from about 1000 to about 930, for only about 70 years, you have a United Kingdom, because then the kingdom gets divided into the north and south, and you have King Rehoboam on one side and King Jeroboam on the other.
Why does it say captain under David?
Because it says that he was Saul's captain. So it'll show the relationship between the previous king. So David is the captain for Saul, and then Solomon was David's son. So if the person then takes over as their son, then it'll just say son, son. We had Queen Natalia, as we read about a few weeks ago. We had a queen for a while, not a very good lady. Hardly. She was pretty bad from start to finish. She's bad. But then her son becomes king after, and then his son becomes king after that. And usually it's the son. In the kingdom of Judah, there's generational turnover, which is good. I mean, sometimes the king's not king for very long. Ammon was only king for 2 years. And some of these kings were deposed, were killed. And they're all sons until we get to King Josiah, who his son becomes king, and then he's deposed by the Egyptians, Jehoiakim, and we just read this, so I wasn't going to necessarily go through it, but for the people who were here a couple weeks ago on Tuesdays, Josiah's 3 sons become king. This son, then Jehoiakim's son, and then it goes back to his uncle, Josiah's other son, Zedekiah, and he's the last king of Judah. So Josiah's 3 sons and 1 grandson are the last 4 kings of Israel, and you can see that all happens in a period of 20 years.
And they were all evil. They were all evil except for him.
Yeah, they're all bad. Wow. It was bad. I mean, after Josiah, who's super good, but dies very young, all the rest of that is bad. And of course, then you have the destruction of the temple, which we're going to get to in a second. But and then this is when the kingdom of Israel, their kings, look, they're always bad. Now, one of the reasons they're always bad is because the people who write the story are these people right here who didn't want a divided kingdom. So the only time you have a king that ever starts off good is Yehu, who ends up killing Yoram. He's the one who takes over from the Omrid dynasty, this dynasty that lasts from 885 to 840. Again, Omri is a captain. He kills Zimri. Zimri killed Elah. These were oftentimes, whenever you see a captain taking over, generally speaking, or in this case, these guys doesn't even say what they are. This guy's a captain. They killed the person. They were a military guy. It was a military coup. So the Northern Kingdom was a disaster. There were a couple of kings that ruled for a really long time. Yehu's king for a long time. Ahab was a bad king, at least from the Judah side. He rules for 20 years. That's pretty long time. That's pretty good. It's a pretty solid stuff, but they don't like him. I mean, because he's not, he's not a good person for the people who worship God, if you will, and for the people who are, you know, remember Ahab was going up against this guy, Elijah and Elisha. These guys were the prophets that were taking him to task. So this chart's got everything. This is like the comprehensive chart, and I'll post that up because it talks about this united monarchy period, and then the split monarchy period, and then the destruction of this. Now, when we get into this period, right, we'll start to find evidence for things. But before that, let's also just talk for a minute about Jerusalem, and this is real important, and this is kind of like the link, if you will, to what we talk about here for the rest of the evening, for the next 20 minutes or so, which is what happens in Jerusalem. And we have excavated a lot, but there's a lot we can't excavate because what we know is that King David, I'll show you this picture first, actually. This is Jerusalem. And for those who've been with us on Tuesdays, we've had lots of discussions about this. We've talked about it. We've shown these maps. But it's always good to remember what's going on here, which is this is what Jerusalem looks like today, right now. This is the Temple Mount. This is where Solomon's temple was. And what did that temple look like during Solomon's time? It looked like this from the outside. A big temple with an altar out in front, big bronze laver filled with water, gallons, hundreds of gallons of water out in front. And inside, based on the descriptions, looks something like this. Covered in gold, these two very big bronze columns in front, and this beautiful gold-covered interior sanctuary with a priest. There's an altar here too. And of course, right here is where you have the ark. Underneath, big kruvim, and there's also kruvim on top of the ark. This is roughly what it would have looked like. Gives you kind of proportional dimensions, how big the kruvim were, how big the ark was, how big the ark is, how big the temple is. This is the Holy of Holies behind this piece right here, and then this is where the ark is. So this is the Temple Mount, which looks like it's underneath this today. This is the outline of what we see here as the City of David. City of David with Mount Moriah, the temple here, palace down here, and other buildings here. Now, what's confusing for people is that this is not within the city wall of Jerusalem today. This is the city wall that was built by the Ottoman Turks that goes along on two sides, right? Here is the eastern side, and here's the southern side. Here's the Wailing Wall here. the Western Wall, but this is the Temple Mount. But coming off of what would be the south end, this is the area where today we have the excavations of the city of David. But it's not inside the city of Jerusalem. So everybody says, well, it's the city of David, it's the city of Jerusalem. Yes, but understand that it's not exactly the same dimensions. This is the wall of the outside of the city, the old city. Now, that wall was built by the Ottoman Turks because in that period, that's where people were living. There are people living here. This is the area we've talked about before called Silwan. This is an area where it was, I've said this so many times, and I know people are sick of me saying it, but I'll say it again and again. This is kind of what it looked like from another angle. This is the temple. I mean, this is the palace. These are where the people lived, and this is where the temple would be built. This is what it would have looked like during the time of King David and Solomon when Solomon was preparing to build the temple here on top. And eventually, again, it would look like that. And that's what it looks like today. The orientation is totally different because, again, we're here at the Western Wall. But this area, folks, and this is the part that I say people are sick and tired of me saying, Israel is excavating in this area, and it has upset people because this is East Jerusalem and it's not the Jewish side of Jerusalem. This is the Jewish side of Jerusalem. This is the new city. But this area is being excavated because, again, this is where the city of David is. And it required Israel to basically kick out people who are living in this area. They were compensated for these homes, but there were not a lot of them, and they were also not in great shape, and they were also not ancient. These were not ancient homes. And so Israel has used eminent domain because Israel has annexed Jerusalem. Israel does not consider any part of Jerusalem not, there's no part of Jerusalem that Israel says is not going to be part of Israel forever. Okay? But that doesn't make people happy. I don't know what to tell you. But that's the way it is. Everybody with me so far?
Yep.
So
Yes.
how many times have I said that, John? How many times have I talked about Silwan? I'm not going to show the picture again because I've shown that picture and it doesn't matter. You can see it from here. These are essentially not very nice buildings. They're slums. And they're not old
In
slums.
that,
They're not. What?
hold on, I gotta, well, because I've seen it, right?
You saw it with your own eyes. You saw it with your own eyes a year ago. A year
yeah,
ago.
the gully,
It's filled with
what is it?
garbage.
Oh my God.
Yeah, the valley.
It's
a little,
filled with garbage.
yeah. So it's not like this is a major uprooting of people. And again, I know people are saying, well, you're just saying it because trust me when I tell you, this is literally, if the argument was you're kicking people out of homes that they've lived in for generations and generations, and they're beautiful homes that, they're entitled to, and I'm telling you, it's not the case. So it was not inhabited. It was not inhabited at all. You can see the drawings that were done by not Jews, by British people, by Turkish people. They were not in the old photographs, the very first photographs from the 1800s. There are no buildings there. Period. There's nothing there. So we know it's not. So, and there's no documents that people own them. They can't come up with There's no ownership documents that people are saying you're kicking us out of our house. We have title to it. They don't have title to it. They're squatting there anyways. So there's not even legal ownership. So this area is very important for excavation. It's being excavated. Israel has basically gone ahead and excavated it. And we can't excavate here, though, which is underneath the Temple Mount. And so that we can't excavate underneath here. We've excavated underneath it, but we can't excavate obviously on top and in the layers that we really would need to go through in order to, do an excavation of the temple. We can't do it. So back to what we know about this period. We do have evidence of Jerusalem through the city of David. And we have our first mention of David in the Tel Dan inscription, which talks about the house of David. It's from about 850 BCE and is the earliest mention of David. So then that gets to, was there really a David? The consensus by most scholars is that David did exist. His kingdom might have been less powerful, smaller than the Bible portrays it, but it does seem that he did exist. I believe that the stories that are in the books of Samuel and the books of Kings that talk about his family are real stories, and they were written by people who knew them. And I think it's interesting that the stories themselves do not, for the most part, always portray positive sides of these kings, including King David. When David's affair with Bathsheba is brought to light, they're basically saying this guy is flawed. And so when we get to this period of 800s, we then start to see a lineup of a good correlation between the archaeology and what the Bible says. Now, I think that there's two things to keep in mind here. Part of it is because we've been able to excavate those periods a lot easier, and there were more Israelites by this time, for sure. And so there's more material culture. There's more stuff to find. There's things, we can find them. But I think there's another issue here, which I think will make sense to you logically. The Bible is written during this period. It's written during this time. And we're going to talk about this on the Tuesday classes quite a bit, which is that there is something I think it kind of makes sense to you, which is if you're writing closer to the time that the things happened, they're probably going to be a little closer to the truth. They're less mythological. They're less kind of fanciful. They're less imagined because you might have talked to somebody who actually was there, or you might have been there, and you tell your story. And so you might embellish it a little bit, but you also don't need to embellish it because you saw it. And so the closer we get to those events, the archaeology bears it out. So what I'm saying is if somebody from the 800s is writing about Abraham that lived in 2000, which is over 1,000 years before, maybe there's some imagination or some, if you will, mythologizing about that person because it was written so long after the person lived. But if you're writing about somebody that you knew or your parents knew, chances are you're going to get a little closer to the actual evidence, factual things that we can prove factually. So I hope that kind of makes sense. And I want to tell you, look, there's a lot of good explanations for this. This one is actually one of my professor's books, Richard Friedman. We're going to talk about this again a little bit when we read the second creation story Tuesday morning. So it's a little pitch again for those who want to read the creation story with us next Tuesday at 9. We'll be online, by the way. I'm not going to be in person. We'll be online. Um, this is Friedman's book. He wrote the book Who Wrote the Bible. That's his classic book, which is an explanation for how the Bible was written. And I definitely recommend Who Wrote the Bible. That's this book. But for people who've either read that book or want to understand a little bit about how the story was written, he wrote this book called The Hidden Book of the Bible, which explains how the author, the author we call the J author, wrote a book that starts in Genesis and goes all the way to King David, all the way through the Kings. And what's interesting about the story is it's a unified story with themes that repeat throughout the story. And that's one of the reasons why he says it's one story. And it's an amazing story. Again, in his words, it's a long, exquisitely connected prose composition full of artistry and power. So he's going to tell you what we can say as a historian, because at the end of the day, he's a historian and he's a biblical scholar, but he looks at it from history, but he also understands the literary power of it too. So it's definitely an interesting read if you want to kind of understand what may be part of the underpinnings of the Bible, that kind of cuts across history, but also explains the reason for it existing the way it does. Some people get frustrated with it. Some people get frustrated with why does the Bible kind of meander and go into these kinds of things, and partly because it's again the texts were woven together. J is only one of the texts in the Bible, so it actually reads really well, I think. I mean, he'll explain it, but if you want to read more about like what's behind it and where are we kind of deriving a lot of the story from, it's from here. Now, again, it's because to some extent the J author who's telling a story has those historical nuggets in them. A lot of the other parts of the Bible are not about that at all. The book of Leviticus is about law. It's not about narrative. It's not going to really help us at all reconstructing the history. It's important, but it's not important from a historical standpoint. I mean, it is from the standpoint of telling us what our ancestors did in the temple, but beyond that, it doesn't tell us very much about our history. So, I want to be the reason, and I'm going to post everything that I shared today. I'm going to post up, but I want to be, when we look at history, and not when we look at the Bible as history and not necessarily just as inspiration or or law. I want to be honest though when we say, well, what do we actually know happens? That we can prove, and I want to be honest about it because when we're looking at it from history, I'm not going to tell you something that is based on faith or based on the inspiration or and really the spiritual power of the text. This is what this chart is based on, what we can say from the archaeology and again, maybe what we can take away from it. So I want to give credit. I want to give credit to AI for this again, which is something that it articulated it much quicker than I could have. So again, this allowed me to create a chart, and I want people to have something that they can take home, and so all of this will be up within the next hour. I'll put all of these texts and maps and stuff that we looked at, and this video will also be up there too. So next week we're going to continue with what happens after the Kings. And for those who've been with us in Chronicles just a couple weeks ago when we read the Book of Chronicles. You know what happens. We know how that comes to an end, but that's where we start next week. We go through the destruction of this first temple and into the emergence of the second temple, the building of the second temple, but not the destruction of the second temple. That will really be in the third class when we look at the rabbinic period. So the next part is also biblical and also this area we call the Dark Ages in Jewish history, not because it's a bad time, just we don't know a lot about it. It's about 400 BCE to about 200 BCE. We're within that period we're going to look at next week. We just don't know a lot. We don't have a lot of stuff on it. So that'll be next week. So today we kind of covered from like 2000 BCE to 586 or 580, whatever, to the end of the Kings. And then next week we'll talk about the destruction, exile, and basically 586 to 0 to 1, and then we'll be in the rabbinic period the week after. So well, this is what we're doing a little bit coming up, and that's for this evening. Thank you, everybody. I hope it helped a little bit for the people who've been studying Bible with us for the last couple years to at least do part one or part one. We did 1.5 because the last part of the Bible is really 0.5 or 0.25, which is the last part of the history that overlaps with the Bible as well. So thank you everybody for being here tonight, and I wish you a good rest of the week. And for those
Thank
that are
you.
in colder climes, stay warm. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thanks,
you.
Rabbi.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
We'll see you.
See you Tuesday.
See you Tuesday. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye.